Good morning, everyone. Today we will see a brief introduction to synchronization. So it has several overlaps with some of the topics we've seen already, but it also has many complementary aspects. So let me share my screen. Okay, so we'll see oscillators and synchronization and some gates in heterogeneous oscillators. So just to remember, a few classes ago, we saw the slower is faster effect, and it's prevalent in many different phenomena, and basically characterized by a phase transition, where basically if you increase indefinitely one variable, then the system will break. So it's also related to the article we read of Ashby. You could say that slower is faster effect is related to a breakage in the system, that you, as a variable increases, then the behavior of the system changes, and that leads to a decrease in performance. You also presented project proposals, and there are a very broad variety of projects, so this will be interesting. If you didn't present, I still have to check the ones which were uploaded online, because there are some people who cannot attend the live sessions because of time constraints or time zone differences. So I still have to give comments to those proposals, but I should do it this week. So Christian Huygens was a polymath physicist, among other things, from the Netherlands, and well, he was contemporary of Newton, and actually there were a bit of rivals. Together with Leibniz, they questioned Newton why didn't he define mass and momentum and time or something like that. I can't remember precisely which terms they asked. And Newton told, "Oh, I don't need to define them, for they are well known of everyone." And and it's like, well, yeah, we know when we see them, but anyway. So among other things, Huygens invented the pendulum clock. So he had lots of clocks in his house, which is in Amsterdam, in one of the main streets. And so why was it relevant to have pendulum clocks? I think I already mentioned that it became important in the age of exploration to keep precise time, so that you would be able to draw maps, to measure distances of ships. Let's say before the age of discoveries, let's say 1492, in Europe, let's say it was not a problem if, let's say, there was a 15-minute time difference between Paris and London. So they could adjust their clocks with the sunrise or sunset, or with the highest point of the sun at noon. So let's say the sun clocks were, let's say, perhaps good enough to keep this, let's say, the time between noon and noon was enough to do it with more rudimentary clocks. However, when you needed, let's say, to measure the distance you have traveled, not only the latitude but the longitude. I mean, the latitude you can measure with depending if you know which day of the year and what's the angle of the sun and where's the north, then you can calculate what's your latitude. Or also with the stars. But the longitude, they didn't have enough. They didn't have the tools to calculate it without keeping time. So they needed precise timing in order to be able to do proper maps. And you can see it because in the 16th century maps, I mean, you can compare it with the real satellite images, and distances are all over the place. In some parts, let's say in the first maps of the Americas, you can see that some parts are exaggerated, some are tiny, because they would measure, how many days we have traveled, but of course different days they would travel at different speeds because of wind and everything. So anyway, there was a big push for keeping time, and pendulum clocks were a breakthrough that allowed them to keep time much more precisely, and that continued. And actually, clock making led to the building of the first automatas, which we now call robots. So yeah, it was important technology, motivated by the needs of the time for exploration. And the Netherlands was, I think, in the 17th century, not yet, but in the 18th century, it was the third largest empire in the world. Yeah, well, was it then? Because it was Spain, England, France. I can't remember in which century it was the third largest. Maybe it was after Spain lost all their colonies. So then it was 19th century. Yeah. So Huygens fell ill, so he was in bed, and he had nothing to do, and noticed that the two pendulums got synchronized. They became coupled they were on the same wall, and they suddenly started oscillating in synchrony. So this is because they kind of transmit vibrations through the wall, and they can kind of adjust the small perturbation. So even if they start out of sync, they will turn to synchronization. So he described these oscillators, which is any system with a periodic behavior. So we can say that our planet is an oscillator because we have these cycles between day and night. But this idea can be generalized not only to time, but also to the phase space. So, for example, we already saw attractors in random Boolean networks. We have cyclic attractors, so these can also be described as oscillators because they go around a specific cycle. So, circadian rhythms are in time, but also in phase space, meaning that we go from state to state. Also, the planet goes from day state to night state and back, and so on. And oscillators have a characteristic wave and amplitude. So the easiest way to see it with waves, like sound waves or any kind of wave. So yeah, you can map, let's say, the movement around the circle into a sinus wave, for example. So oscillators are usually stable, meaning that they return to the attractor after perturbations. So some examples of coupled oscillators are the pacemaker cells in the heart, also the cells that secrete insulin in the pancreas, some neural networks in the brain and the spine that control locomotion and breathing and chewing and other functions they need to synchronize. Crickets, fireflies, clapping in concerts. El Botellón was a phenomenon in Spain. So in the early days of mobile phones, so this is which year? Early 20th century, no, early 21st century. So many young people would coordinate with SMS. Back in the day, one SMS costs, the cost of sending one SMS was €1. So it was very expensive to use this technology. But then the young people in south of Spain would self-organize, telling, oh, we will meet in this street at, I don't know, 2 a.m. in the morning, and we'll have a party there. And suddenly 3,000 people would arrive in a calm neighborhood in the middle of the night and start playing music and drinking and partying. And it was something that the authorities couldn't handle because they didn't know where this will arise. How did they all coordinate and come to the same point at the same time? And the solution, at least in Granada, was that they organized, okay, every Saturday, the botellón will be in the parking lot of El Corte Inglés, and that's it. It's forbidden to gather large amount of people in other places of the city. So they would go there, and then Sunday morning it would be like full of garbage in the parking lot. But let's say at least they weren't bothering neighbors as it was before. So yeah, I'll show you the example of fireflies with more detail later. Let me just tell about the heartbeat, the peacemaker cells. Well, I should also tell about peacemaker cells, but just a moment. So the most common coupling between oscillators is synchronization, and basically when the phases are the same of different oscillators, so they go on the same state at the same time, or they start their cycle at the same time. So one example is with fireflies that were discovered in the Asian Southeast, in the Pacific. And this again was with Dutch explorers. So I think that was somewhere around the 18th or 19th century. Remember that Malaysia or no, in Indonesia was a Dutch colony. So somewhere on those islands where they were getting spices. And let's say when the night falls, there's no synchrony, but then after some hours, you can see whole trees that are flashing in synchrony. And the light that a single insect produces, it's, I don't know, like 0.1 or less lumens. So it's less than a candlelight. But still, there are so many that the natives would use the flashing of the fireflies to guide them at night. So they will go out to sea to fish, and then they will be able to go back to their home rivers because of the fireflies. And when the first European explorers saw this and then went back to Europe and they reported this phenomena, many people didn't believe them. For many reasons. One, European and North American fireflies don't synchronize. so this phenomena was never perceived with other types of other species of fireflies. Then the second is that they didn't have the mathematical tools to even imagine that they could synchronize. I mean, it seemed like magic. Odin seems to know more about the botellón. I lived 5 months in Granada. That's why I know about it. Yeah. Not that I went, but one of my colleagues told us about it as an example of self-organizing system. Okay, so going back to the fireflies, still in the 20th century, like 1940s or 1950s, there were scientific papers trying to explain this phenomenon as an illusion, saying that it's just an optical illusion and it has to do with the blinking and it's not really there, the synchronization. And actually, the mathematics were developed only in the 1980s. And also, you need computers in order to be able to observe how this coupling can take place. So this coupling is by pulses. So to model coupling of oscillators just with pen and paper is very difficult because you need to explicitly model interactions. So, for example, you can use the Poincaré section, which is something that was used also to study deterministic chaos. So it's basically you have a cycle, and then you kind of slice. For example, it's very common to represent oscillators in a circle, and each cycle they go on the, let's say, 12 o'clock, like a clock that goes around, and every time it goes to the top, you restart or a new cycle. So the Poincaré section would be a way of representing in which state the system is every time it passes through one. So, for example, for the 12 o'clock mark, and then you start painting that and forget about all the details, and then that can be useful to analyze behavior. And then Peshkin, I forget which year was it, maybe 50s or 60s. He developed the mathematics to study two coupled oscillators, only two, and inspired by pacemaker cells. So pacemaker cells, we have about 10,000 in which part of the heart? I think it's the top of the heart. And if they need to synchronize in order to tell the rest of the cardiac tissue to contract, and if they don't synchronize, then the heart doesn't function properly. So basically, you need enough electric potential to trigger the contraction of the muscle. Basically, all the pacemaker cells need to fire. I mean, I understand they're like neurons, like neural cells. And if they don't synchronize, then let's say they wouldn't gather enough electric potential so that all the cardiac tissue would contract in synchrony. That's what we need to survive. So how do they reach this synchrony without a central controller? Because it's not like a single nerve tells the 10,000 cells, okay, now you will fire. And also, how can they adapt to the changing heart rhythm? And actually, when they cannot adapt, well, a sign of a sick heart is that they are unable to adapt. So actually, healthy hearts have chaotic dynamics and sick hearts have order dynamics. And basically, they can't adapt to changes in the demand of oxygen. So that's why people with heart problems, they run out of breath easily because their heart cannot increase the blood flow. And healthy hearts, they will change just like if I raise my hand, then they will, let's say, the heart adjusts to that immediately. Okay, so it was only in the 80s that Miroyo and Strogatz generalized Peshkin's models for N oscillators and showed that it always synchronizes. So there were already computers by then. So it seems we needed computers in order to do the synchronization. So we can classify patterns of oscillator networks, of coupled oscillator networks. So phase locking is when, let's say, the phases are locked and basically they are on synchronization. And this has to do with symmetry breaking, in the sense that if you have a symmetry, let's say in a network, that would mean that you cannot distinguish where you are. Sorry, again, it's the opposite. The synchronization is a symmetric state because, let's say, all the oscillators are in the same phase. But then this can change, and let's say you can gain symmetry or break symmetry, and there are different mechanisms for this. So, for example, a jump would be an example of two coupled oscillators, basically our legs that are synchronized, but when we are walking, they are anti-synchronized, because let's say when one leg is in front, the other is behind, and then they switch and things like that. So we can plot this like this. So if we jump like a kangaroo, then the legs go together. So they are synchronized, these coupled oscillators. When we walk, the coupled oscillators are anti-synchronized, and we can put more oscillators that are synchronized. Here there's an example of 3 out of phase. So it would be similar. Sorry, no, it's not similar to this. I mean, it's just with dephasing of 1/3 of the cycle. And you can have 2 synchronized and 1 that is not correlated. And for example, a person walking with a stick, the stick has twice the, it's the period is twice as fast, meaning half. So the legs are anti-synchronized, but then let's say each step the cane or the walking stick moves front and back. So that's why, let's say, it moves the whole cycle every time one leg does half a cycle. And there has been much done about neural synchronization because, let's say, not only synchronization, but if we see our extremities for the sense of any animals as oscillators, then how do they coordinate for different types of movements? And it can be not only for walking and jumping, but let's say hexapods, tetrapods, they have more complicated gaits than bipeds. And if you go to centipedes or millipedes, then it's like, how do they walk with different gaits, and how do they coordinate? Is there a central clock that kind of tells each leg when to move and when to do what? And I mean, it's still, the debate is not settled, but if there was a central controller, then animals that have different gaits, like horses that walk and trot and gallop and prance, and I don't know, there are lots of names for the different gaits, they would need a different central generators of patterns, or different neural circuits that would kind of produce that pattern. However, if the gaits are distributed, meaning that they are produced by the interactions of oscillators, then you just need to change the coupling strength of the oscillators. So the same mechanisms can be adapted with a single parameter. So here's a way of plotting gaits, in this case of tetrapods. I mean, imagine these are horses. So a walking trot, you have the left hind and the right front legs coupled. So if you're like this, then this will go front, and then So first these ones, and then these ones, and then this one. Well, I hope you can imagine better because I can't coordinate my fingers properly. And then there are others more complicated, gallops and bound. It's like a rabbit. So the front legs together with the hind legs. So it would be like this. Say jumping. Well, these trots, they are basically the opposite corners of legs are synchronized. And in gallop, each leg has its own phase. But they're much more complicated gaits than this. So yeah, for quadrupeds, people kind of using mathematical tools kind of exhaustively describe all possible gaits. And most of these have names in, so for example, there's canter, loping rack, transverse gallop, loping bound. And I mean, I suppose people who know about horses know what I'm speaking about. Jumping, loping bound, and so on. And they have different properties. You can describe them mathematically. One example by Randall Beer and from Case Western Reserve University from the 1990s, they simulated a cockroach and built a robot. So this is a picture of this robot, and this is the simulated cockroach. So they have similar representations, but now with 6 legs. And on the left, there are simulated gaits, and on the right, they basically build the robot and it reproduces the same gaits. So I forgot to mention the black lines indicate when the leg touches the ground, and it's white when it's above. So and the time flows to the right. So, for example, in the bottom, you can see there's a symmetry. So you have now 6 legs, and kind of these two, or these two, and the center one of the other side, they are synchronized, and the other 3. But here there is a moment where they no leg touches the ground. So that's the definition of running, as opposed to walking. If at some moment you are flying, let's say no part of the animal touches the ground, then it's running. So actually, it was thought that elephants cannot run because they're very heavy. So they would say, no, they're just walk fast. But they always keep at least one extremity on ground. But then with high-speed cameras, they recently saw that they can run. So they can be without touching the ground for just a little moment. But anyway, they were able to reproduce very different locomotion patterns that are also observed in real cockroaches. And they were inspired by the real neural networks of cockroaches. So this is the artificial neural network that they use to control the simulated cockroach and the robot cockroach. So each leg has one of these sets of 7 neurons. So they have a pacemaker cells and sensors for the angle, and then this command neuron. And these are motor neurons. So the backwards swing, basically it moves backwards, the forward swing moves forward, and the foot, it raises and lowers. And there are excitatory connections and inhibitory connections. I think these were hardwired, not evolved or learned, or maybe the precise weights. I forget how they build this precisely. And I can imagine that you could simplify, instead of having one neuron for backward swing and another one for forward swing, you could have the same and just take positive and negative values, and the same for the angle sensors. So, I mean, I'm sure this could be simplified. But then this was the circuit for each leg, for the controller of each leg. And then there were inhibitory connections of adjacent pacemaker cells. So these pacemaker cells, this would inhibit the closest neighbors, and it would be inhibited by those same neighbors. So this connection. So the ones on the same segments and the ones in front and behind. So yeah, in this way, you don't need a central controller, and you can reproduce a broad variety of gates depending on the coupling strength of the oscillators. In this case, how much the pacemaker cells inhibit each other. So all these, well, not all these, but most of these studies refer to homogeneous oscillators, meaning that they are all the same. They have all the same period. But you can still synchronize oscillators with different frequencies and different periods if their couplings are strong enough. So, for example, there's some algae that they have a circadian rhythm, but they're unicellular algae, and they are bioluminescent, but basically they glow in the night. But then they made an experiment that, well, in natural conditions, they glow only in the night, and in the day they don't glow. So they have an internal rhythm. But then they put them in a laboratory with constant light, not so bright, not so dark, and they kind of lose their cycle, meaning that each individual cell has a different circadian rhythm, and they use the sunlight for synchronization. So that's an external signal. In that case, it is a centralized controller, and there's no interaction between each cells. And I mean, they synchronize in the sense that they all glow in the night, but they don't have to do it very precisely, meaning that some cells can start 5 minutes later than others, and same for finishing. That's not a problem. And in natural conditions, then the sun cycle can perform that coordination easily. So they don't need to do coupling like fireflies, that their period is a few seconds, and there's no external signal that can guide them for that synchronization. So, but anyway, they are heterogeneous oscillators, and still they manage to synchronize thanks to this external controller. So there are many models to study oscillators, and Winfreys model is one for heterogeneous oscillators, and whether the oscillators can reach synchronization or not depends on the variance of the frequencies. So imagine that these are different oscillators in different colors, the little balls, and they go around the circle, and some go faster than others. So with time they spread out. However, if their coupling strength is strong enough, then they can synchronize. Basically, if the faster ones can be pulled by the majority, and the slower ones can also be pulled by the majority, so that they go fast enough, then they can synchronize, and then they all go at the same speed. And of course, it's a balance between the coupling strength and the differences in the speeds, or let's say the periods of the oscillators. And there's a positive feedback. If some oscillators manage to synchronize, then this will pull stronger the other oscillators that are yet to be synchronized. So it's similar to phase transitions in the sense that for certain region of the parameter space, let's say it always synchronizes, and in another region it never synchronizes. So perhaps the most popular model is Kuramoto Model, which has been used for coupled oscillators. And more recently, let's say with the development of network science, people have studied synchronization of Kuramoto oscillators in networks with different topologies. We still have to see more about network science, but I just want to say that if you want to oscillate these networks, it makes a difference whether you have, for example, a grid, and then you just need to coordinate with your neighbors, and then the neighbors with their neighbors and things like that. But that could give you like some regions where you have like a wave that goes through the grid. And if you have, for example, a scale-free network where few nodes have lots of connections, then probably that will promote the synchronization so that it converges faster. Amari writes in the chat, last week, a paper published by Strogatz et al. About global synchronization for oscillators on random graph. Yeah, thanks. It's precisely on this topic. I hadn't seen it, but it's... Okay. So I'll give conclusions, and then we'll play in NetLogo with a model of Firefly synchronization. So, I mean, synchronization, it's complex, distributed, interesting. It is natural. Many organisms exploit it. The relationship with complexity is that they require interactions. Well, systems require to interact in order to synchronize in most cases. If there's an external signal, like in the case of this algae, that the circadian rhythm is imposed by the sun, which is an external signal, then you don't need interactions. But in most cases, you don't have that signal. So then you need a mechanism that can synchronize. And in many cases, this can be described as self-organization. And you can also see this as a symmetry breaking, and it's related to phase transitions. And you can also see this as a type of adaptation, so that, especially in heterogeneous oscillators, so that they can couple properly given the variance of the periods of the oscillators. Let me see. Yeah, for the next class, we'll see computing networks, and we'll discuss a paper on global risks that, let's say, it's from before the pandemic, but it kind of tells you that such a risk exists. Okay. Are there any questions while I start NetLogo? Lucrecia writes, it is useful to do a correlation analysis at the time of synchronization to confirm the phenomenon, or is redundant because of the spontaneous coordination is evident? I guess it depends on what you're interested in, and also which kind of system you are studying. Because let's say if you are studying like animals, then in some cases it's easier just to observe whether they synchronize or not. Let's say even before you get the data or process the data. But if you are working with an abstract model, then a correlation analysis can be very useful to, let's say, analyze properly not only whether it's synchronized or not, but what are the median times towards synchronization. And I don't think it's redundant because spontaneous coordination is not always evident. Maybe after you do the correlation analysis, then you can say, well, of course, it's evident that they will coordinate. Okay. Any other question? Arodi asks, could you repeat the relationship between scale invariance and synchronization? I think I didn't speak about scale invariance. I mention that in Kuramoto models, in networks of Kuramoto oscillators, if you have scale-free networks which are scale invariant, then usually synchronization can be achieved easier and faster because you have few oscillators that can influence lots of oscillators or can be influenced by lots of oscillators. So this can serve partly as guiding signals or to guide consensus in a specific way. And if you have, let's say, a homogeneous network where all nodes are as important as others, then this consensus can take forever. And we'll see it now with fireflies. So here, the fireflies, there's no leader firefly that has more weight than others because, for example, a classic example of self-organization is bird flocking, meaning that there's no leader and with local rules, they can organize into flocks. However, a few years ago, some colleagues from Hungary, they put tiny GPSs in backpacks of pigeons, so they could track the 3D trajectories of pigeons in Budapest, and they found that the relationships are not symmetric between pigeons. Basically, the same pecking order of the social hierarchy in pigeons determines who will follow who. So the alpha pigeons don't follow anyone, and they go like in the center of the flock. And then the beta pigeons follow the alpha, but not the gamma, and so on. And the lowest ranked pigeons, they follow everyone. So it is these mechanisms of, let's say, just trusting your neighbors, but not all the neighbors in pigeons are the same. Very probably in larger flocks or in schools of fishes, these relationships are more difficult to follow because, let's say, if you are part of a flock or school or swarm of, I don't know, more than 100 animals, then it's difficult to distinguish among them and to remember who is the alpha. So it becomes more and more homogeneous as the sizes of the animal groups increase. Okay. So in the models library, if you go to biology, there's Fireflies model, and let me share screen. So Heriberto asks, is really sync the same phenomenon in living beings and things like pendulum? Or is it more like an epiphenomenon? I mean, synchronization is defined arbitrarily by us observers. So again, it is simply periodic behavior. And of course, in a pendulum, this period is better defined than in an animal, that even when you can define circadian rhythms, then let's say not necessarily every day will have the same length. So mathematically, yes, they're the same, but in living systems, you can have more nuances also because the internal dynamics of each animal can influence the synchronization or not synchronization. And let's say non-living systems tend to be much more reactive. But it is interesting how also non-living systems can synchronize. Yeah, like pendulum. And, which other examples of synchronization from the non-living? I don't know. Maybe some physicists here can give examples of non-living synchronization, or simply coupled oscillators. Well, Elio asks, is synchronization temporal emergence? I guess depends on your definition of emergence. My own definition of emergence is properties that arise at one scale and are not present at another scale. So according to that definition, yes, synchronization can be seen as temporal emergence because, let's say, you can perceive global patterns that are not necessarily possible when you study the elements in isolation. I mean, if you have a single oscillator, synchronization is not definable because synchronization requires more than one oscillator. But there are many definitions of emergence, and probably for some of these, they would say, no, synchronization is not emergent. Okay, so the Firefly models, let's just run it and then we'll go into the details. So we generate 1,500 fireflies, and they all start with a different phase, but they all have the same period, which here it's called cycle length, which is 10. And I'll just show all the fireflies and make it slower. So basically, they start flashing randomly, and here at the bottom in the plot, you can see how many fireflies are flashing. How many fireflies are flashing in that time step. And let's say, since they are initialized randomly with random phases, then on average, let's say, so what it's 10. So about 10% of the fireflies are flashing always. Then you can see that more and more fireflies start to coordinate. And then the synchronization arises. So I'll just increase the speed. And then they lose a bit, and then they gain a bit. Synchronization, and you can see already that they are flashing, even when not all of them are flashing at the same time. They're starting to coordinate, and now all of them are flashing in unison, and that's stable. They all stay like that. Now, how do they do it? There's this strategy called delay. So let's go to the code. Well, later you can check the info, and here they explain all the details and some of the things that we already mentioned about fireflies. Then let's go to the code. So first they define some variables of the fireflies, which remember in NetLogo, agents are called turtles because of logo. So you will add them, they add these variables, the clock, which is the internal clock of each firefly, the threshold, which is basically the periods, restable, basically what this is for one of the strategies, and then the window when they can reset their clock. So all this initializes the simulation, and then the basic cycle go asks all the turtles to move to increment their clock, and if the clock is greater than the window and the clock is greater than the threshold, then they look around, and then we will see what these functions do. And then they color them, basically if they're flashing yellow and if not gray, and tick, this basically advances the simulation clock, basically one time step. So, I mean, to recolor, it's just if if the clock reaches the threshold, basically threshold would be what we're calling the period. There's a random movement. So we'll play with this in a moment. And then to increase the clock, it basically adds 1 to the clock. And then it resets if it equals the cycle length. So basically what they call clock, it's what we call the phase. And the cycle length would be the period. And then to look, it counts turtles in a certain radius, well, of 1, basically its closest neighbors. Let's say a radius of 1 patches. And if they are flashing, basically if they have the color yellow, then if the number of turtles that are flashing at that moment is greater than these flashes to reset, then reset the clock, basically synchronize with those turtles that just turtles, fireflies that just flashed. So here, the flashes to reset, you just need 1 neighbor to flash in order to reset your clock. So basically, I will have my clock, and then then the number of flashes to reset, I forget. Was it is a parameter, or where is this flashes to reset? 1. No. Yeah, there was another variable which was the code threshold. Yeah. Okay, so threshold is the flash length. Okay, so it's just 1. So basically, the flash length is for how many time steps the fireflies will stay on. So let's just run this again. It took about 600 time steps for all of them to synchronize. We can accelerate it so that it goes even faster. So about 700 time steps to synchronize, and then let's increase the flash length. So now when they flash, they will stay on for 2 time steps. But then during that time, they won't be able to be influenced by their neighbors. I mean, if the others are flashing, you cannot flash. Sorry, if you are flashing and the others are flashing, then they can't influence you. So I'll just play it faster. So it took about half the time, maybe, well, 300 and something, 350. So let's increase the flash length to 4. And you might think that it will be faster. Actually, it's not so fast than 2, because let's say if the flash is too long, then during that time they cannot synchronize. So let's put 3. Maybe this is better. It's a bit better than 2. But then 4 was already worse. So they synchronize like in 260 steps. And also there are different strategies. So the delay is that you reset your clock, but don't flash. But then when advanced, if someone around you flashes, then you flash at the same time, if I'm not mistaken. Was it like that? Let me check. I don't know, in the code, there's no reference to this strategy. Maybe, yeah. It's just an else, yeah. Okay. So the difference, it's just in the setup. If it's delay, then the reset level is the threshold. And window equals -1. And otherwise, basically the advanced reset level is 0 and window is threshold +1. So it can be reset at any moment, and then the window is greater. So with this strategy, for these parameters, it doesn't synchronize. Let's see if it's this. They don't seem to synchronize. So anyway, let's return to delay. So let's say this again, the parameters. Now let's play with how much the fireflies will move. So we just create a slider. This will be step. Put maximum 10. Oops, what happened? And here where it moves, instead of just one, we put step. And that's it. So if we put 0, then they won't move. Oh, what I want. So let's say you can see that some fireflies coordinate with their neighbors, but then these don't propagate easily through the network. Let me put an increment of 0.1 so that they can move very slowly. And then just accelerate. And with a slight movement, let's say, you can see that there are some patches that are a bit greater, but then since they move, some of this synchronization gets lost, so they take really a lot of time to synchronize. So let me accelerate. So let's say start around time 1000. So Arodi asks, is there a model in NetLogo that incorporates moment without synchronization, like going in and out of synchronization over time? I'm not sure I understand what you mean, like that first they synchronize and then they desynchronize?
Yes, because in this model, I saw that at certain point, the fireflies are all synchronized. But what happens if there is like some perturbation and they start breaking the synchronization, and then after a while they go, they synchronize again, like incorporating perturbations.
Yeah, it's easy to do. I mean, you could add a new function, and then when you press a button, it's kind of reshuffles the phase of a certain percentage of the fireflies, and then you can see how that perturbation affects the synchronization and how long it takes to recover.
Okay.
We can do that now. So yeah, I don't know why it's going. Is it going negative? No. So it began on 73 at first. So I think, yeah, the zero is the bottom. It's not going yet. So it kind of slowly increases the synchronization, but I don't know whether it will synchronize or not. So yeah. So if we increase the speed to 0.5, then it kind of synchronizes. When it goes, when you put it to go too fast, then it kind of skips the drawing of some time steps. So that's why at some point they were all gray. So it took 1800 time steps to synchronize. So that's lower than when it was one time step. When they were moving one time, distance one patch per time step. So let's just run this to be sure that the change we did doesn't affect the simulation. So yeah, about 600 time steps. Now we can see whether accelerating this speed will accelerate the synchronization. So it will be like mixing a bit more the Firefly soup. So they kind of, well, it takes longer, a bit longer, like 900. It kind of reached, but then they synchronize and then they oscillate in and out, because since they're moving, let's say you already had a group that was more or less synchronized, but then they kind of spread out and then they interact with new fireflies that didn't have that period, and then they shift their own phases, and then they decouple until again there's a critical mass, and finally all of them are. And then if they're moving a lot, let's say 10 time steps, let's just see what happens. Basically, every time step they are encountering new neighbors. So you have correlations that are only at the, so yeah, it took about 800. Okay, so now let's play what Rodney suggested. So this will be the percentage. Well, let's leave it at 50%. And then we'll put the button. Perturbate. Okay, so let me, this is line of code that will shuffle everything. So perturb this. So this function will be called with the button that has the same name. And now we will ask let me see if I remember. Ask. So it's number of turtles and then percentage perturbed. divided by 100. We ask them to do this only to those. So working. It goes between brackets. So let's see whether it works. Put it back to 1, and then we just wait. Okay. There we go. Errors. And now it doesn't want to synchronize. So when we press perturbate, it should go like half of the firefly should go down, unless yeah, just there's something wrong. So let me check what is the parameters of let's see. I'm just remembering which function is to get and off. Okay. Let's see whether this works. Well, it did something, but it was not seeable anymore. So synchronize, and then they synchronize. But once they reach full synchronization around time 600, I'll pause it in case something goes horribly while it's updating, and then you can see that it resets, but it quickly synchronized again, even when half of the fireflies were perturbed. If I can imagine that if we perturb less, it will crash. No. It will recover even faster. Oh no. Seems it had even a stronger effect, perturbing less. Let's do it again. Interesting that, let's say, you perturb only a few ones, and then I suppose they kind of influence their neighbors. and then it takes longer to recover than if you perturb more. That was interesting. Let's try again 50%. Maybe it was just lucky the first time. Yeah, it was lucky the first time. Here it took longer. Let's do it again. Do 90%, which so we're in time 3,100, and then we perturbate 90%, so it's almost a reset. So if from initial conditions it took 600 time steps, I would expect that it would take 600 time steps, so it should be like soon, but for some reason it's taking longer. Yeah, 600. It took like 1,000 time steps. Interesting. I suppose there's, in some cases, there's like an initial struggle that delays the synchronization. And if we perturb everything, then it should be like resetting. So the perturbation was time about 4,500. And it seems it synchronizes faster than the perturbation where you don't perturb all of them. I mean, it's interesting because it seems there's a nonlinear relationship between the percentage of perturbations and the time it takes to synchronize. Let's see if you perturb just 1%, whether that does anything. It seems it doesn't do much. But yeah, I mean, you can systematically explore, okay, on average, how long does it take to recover, depending on how many, on what percentage of the fireflies you perturb, and to vary other parameters. And like that, you can find, okay, what would be the maximum perturbation, or better said, which percentage of fireflies perturbed would cause that it would take longer for the fireflies to synchronize again. And it seems it's not a trivial question. and you would need to run several runs for each percentage of perturbation, because you can see that it varies. Okay. And yes, an exercise for the computer science students will be to take this model and implement heterogeneous oscillators and to synchronize them. So here, let's say all the turtles have the same cycle length, and the way of having a heterogeneous cycle length would be adding a variable here, cycle length, cycle length, and then we initialize my cycle length let me see. I mean, there are many random functions. Random normal. random Poisson. Which you like better? It's the random Poisson. So that the mean is equal to the standard deviation. So like this, let's say now, yeah, but we need to change the code where this is used. Because now we have each firefly has its own cycle length, but if they don't use it, then it's senseless. And I think that's only. Okay. So now if we inspect the turtles, so you can see this window. So there's a new window. So for example, this has cycle length of 27. So yeah, on average they have 23. Let's move it back to 10. And then I'll just inspect another turtle, and its value is 10. Well, that's not interesting. But anyway, yeah. Cycle of turtles. So the mean is close to 10, but let's say not all of them. And when you put setup again, it will be a different value. So on average, they all have the same, but they have different values. So let's see whether they can synchronize with this method. And they can't. Since they all have different cycles, even if they synchronize and let's say they start again with the same cycle, then they drift away and the coupling strengths are not enough to keep the synchronization. So exercise for computer scientists, and also if you feel like it, then go ahead. To develop a strategy so that they can synchronize with heterogeneous cycle length. I can share this code so that it will be easier, and then you can just focus on the strategy. Okay. Any questions? Okay. If not, then we'll meet on Thursday. We'll speak about computing networks. Yeah. Okay. So have a great week. See you.
Thank you. Have a great week.
Thank you. Bye.